With all of that, Sherry Turkle is the Abby Rockefeller Mauzé Professor, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology in the Self. Her study of humans interacting with tech dates to the very earliest emergence of what we would today even consider tech, with 1984's The Second Self, Computers and the Human Spirit. A licensed clinical psychologist, she's edited 3 volumes and written 6 books in all. Recent works include 2011's Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, and the 2015 New York Times bestseller, Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age. She's also edited 3 collections, including one of autobiographical essays concerning the power of an object to provoke emotion and reflection, entitled Evocative Objects, Things We Think With, from 2007. Margaret Morris is a clinical psychologist focused on how technology can support well-being. She's an affiliate faculty member in the Information School at the University of Washington and a research consultant. Morris was a senior researcher for Intel and has since conducted research for Amazon and other tech companies. Anyway, she is the author of Left to Our Own Devices, Outsmarting Smart Technology to Reclaim Our Relationships, Health and Focus, which was published in 2018. Turkle's book, The Empathy Diaries, a memoir, is the subject of this evening's talk. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Morris and Sherry Turkle.
Hello, I want to, Sherry, thank you so much for coming to Seattle and talking with us. I know that I'm not alone and absolutely loving the Empathy Diaries. I think it was perhaps best, just and most succinctly lauded as in the New York Times as, in the words of Dwight Garner, a beautiful book that has gravity and grace that drills down into the things that make a life. So it's a particular honor for me to talk with you tonight. You've been an important mentor for me for, almost coming up on 2 decades. And after spending a lot of time with the Empathy Diaries and this whole quarantine season, I have even more admiration for you and for your life's work. So thank you. I thought we could kick things off by asking you to read, and I asked, if you could read a section that describes growing up in the sort of complicated, ever-changing terrain of your home life that made you, in your words, feel like an undercover agent in your own life.
Yes, I'm delighted. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Margie, for being my dialogue partner. And I know this is going to be a great pleasure because whenever we talk, it's always a great pleasure. So this bit of my book describes my mother's remarriage. She'd been divorced, and this is her remarriage, and our move to a housing development called Beach Haven, which, this is an aside, was owned by Fred Trump. And I met the young Donald Trump, who used to collect money from the washing machines. He collected the quarters, so he was always around in Beach Haven. So there where I am living in Beach Haven, I've moved from my grandparents' house where I lived with my mother after, when she was divorced, she went back to live with her parents. And my mother is determined to hide the fact that she's divorced. And she's also determined, so there where I am living in Beach Haven, I have the name of my biological father. So she's married Milton Turkle, but my name is Sherry Zimmerman, something that no one is to know. So that's the setup. In our new neighborhood of Beach, so now I'm reading from the book. In our new neighborhood of Beach Haven, Milton Turkle was presented as my biological father. No one can know, said my mother, that I was married before. No one can know that Milton Turkle is not your father. Of course, every day when I went to school, the name Sherry Zimmerman would be on the class list. And then I had to write this name on every worksheet. I had no choice but to answer to it. How could the name Sherry Zimmerman in school disappear when I went home? I became gripped by a notion, part fantasy, part not, that I was invisible. For decades to come, I sometimes thought that if I didn't arrange my hair in its habitual style or wear full makeup, I would be unrecognizable. In Beach Haven, my mother invited children and their mothers into our apartment. Considering the fortress world of the Bonowitz family, this, like her dinner parties, showed her desire for a different kind of life. But I entered this life with the anxieties of an undercover agent. When other children came for play dates, I was Sherry Turkle and dreaded being discovered a liar. I looked forward to weekends when I could visit my grandparents and relax. Block city and long walks that my grandfather called constitutionals, movies in the theater with my grandmother and aunt, political conversations over meals, talking back to the television when the news came on. My favorite thing was when my aunt and I went to the free Sundays at the big New York museums and sat on a bench in a room with the paintings. My aunt said it was allowed and even encouraged to talk softly in these rooms with the beautiful art. On Brooklyn Saturdays with my grandmother, we would cover long distances, shopping and paying bills. We sometimes took trolley cars and buses, but mostly we went on foot. As we traveled, my grandmother talked to me about her daughters. Her stunning and charismatic Harriet had found a new man. Would her brilliant Mildred find work that was worthy of her? Mildred, she said, was ahead of her time. If Mildred were in her time, according to my grandmother, she would be running the companies where now she was only an office manager. But no man wanted Mildred. She was too smart. My grandmother did not say this at dinner table conversations of how Mildred could find a husband. She admitted these things to me on our excursions. At first, I thought that my grandmother was saying that I would have to choose between femininity and brains. But that wasn't the case. My grandmother knew that my mother had brains aplenty. My mother had skipped every other grade in grammar in middle school and raced through college with medals and awards, but she was also flirtatious and feminine. My Aunt Mildred was quiet and serious. She led with her interests in books and ideas. My grandmother was saying that it wasn't who you were, but what you let other people see. What would I choose to hide, and what would I allow to show?
I love this passage. I mean, and so many parts of it. I think, at the outset, you kind of describe these predicaments that you're in. I think, as the only child, a very super smart girl, trying to sort of figure out what's going on, realizing, okay, I'm asked to keep up a lie that is untenable, right? But you can't say that out loud, even though it must be obvious to everyone. Like you can't, your playmates from school know your name. And so I think that's
So
just
first thing you
a
can do
super
with the SketchUp
interesting,
model is you can just
as
do
a reader,
direct
it's like a
walkthrough or
super
fly through
interesting
video in your
predicament and
presentation.
so
So
nicely
you could walk
described.
in and you could just bring this model
And
in here with you,
I
and you could use
also
it in order to show
love,
different
and
views and fly
especially
through in real
now,
time to
I
answer
think in the
questions
pandemic, the way
and
you
that sort of
describe these
thing.
long
Now,
walks
I
with your
will say, having
grandparents.
done some presentations in the
And I know that
past,
was
if it's
something
going
I
to be
used
any
to go
kind of
for
a
walks
high
with my
pressure
grandfather, and
situation
then with
or
my
anything
father.
like that, I would
And I
recommend setting up
feel like
tabs
I've been
with your
doing a lot of
various
that
views
recently,
and
not
probably labeling them a little
not
better
with
than
my
I've done
grandfather or
here.
father,
But
but
I
like
would recommend setting up those scenes, so all
with
you have to do is
friends,
click on
with my
those
partner.
to
And
get
I
to the
feel like
different
there's a
views that you
simplicity
want. So you
there
could set this scene
that
up and you
we've
could
been
call it
able to have a
kitchen.
bit
That
more
would
of
give you
this
a
last
view
year.
of
I
what
don't
the
know.
kitchen
It sounds
would
like you've
look
been
like.
walking a
So
Yes,
lot
you could
this
a lot,
easily fly
yeah.
through instead of trying to figure out where you
year.
want to put your camera or
I think
anything like that. It really
another
makes everything
part
work a little bit
of
easier
Also,
in
this
SketchUp.
talking back to the
So
television.
the live version is definitely a way that you can do a
yeah,
presentation.
I
The next
mean,
thing you can
it
do is
makes
you
it
can also
clear that
create
for
an
technology to be
animation. So I've talked a
interactive,
little bit about this
that's
in
much
the
more about
past, and
how
I'm
we
going to
relate
try to
to it
link
than the
to some
features or
playlists of some
capabilities that
YouTube
it
Yes,
videos where I
has.
show you how to create some of
yes.
this
And
I
I
stuff
had to
think,
in the
learn
notes
in
below.
a
So make sure you
media
go check
studies
that out.
class The television was a
you
passive
can set
medium.
up different animations.
Because in my family,
so, like,
we
for
talk
example,
back
if you
to the
wanted to create
TV.
a video where you flew around
Yeah.
this house,
And I
what you'd
think,
do is you'd set up a couple
you
different
know, as we'll
scenes, and then you'd
touch on
export
the
an
way you close the
animation.
book, right? Like
And
you
what that
invite
would do is that
us
would
to be talking
export.
back much
Basically,
more
if I
to
go to
technology
view
than we are, right?
animation, and I click
Um,
play, then it would basically
so
export this particular animation. So
I
you can see
think
how what it's
I
doing
want
is
to, you know,
it's just
there's some
transitioning
other
between the
issues that are
scenes that
raised
I've
here about how you're
selected.
going to present
And you can see how
yourself,
I
right? And how
turned
you
all of these
chose in
other
this book
scenes
to
off. If they're in
present
parentheses,
not just
then they're not
your ideas,
included
but also a lot of your
in the
vulnerabilities.
actual animation.
And
So if you look down in your
I'm gonna
scenes section of your
touch
tray,
more
you
on
can check
that
that
a little
box
bit
to
as
turn
we
those on and
move
off.
along in this
And then all
conversation.
you
But for
do
now, I think that,
is,
you know,
first of
one
all,
of
you
the
can go to your
really,
view
I think in some ways, the
animation
heart of this book
settings,
is the
and you can
objects that you describe so vividly. And I was taken back to evocative objects, you know, this another very beautiful book, and the one I think I met you shortly before you started working on this initially, and one of the quotes that is so powerful that opens that book is, you know, we love the objects we think with the objects we love. And I think while many of the objects in the Empathy Diaries are objects that you loved, and you know, and then that kind of speak to joy or like very pleasant moments, I think others are fraught with pain and conflict. And you know, and some of the ones that you described with a real analytic eye are things like your mother's hair clip or the white boots that you wore to Radcliffe. And I was wondering if you could describe some of those objects and all that they kind of capture.
Yes. Well, those are actually two very interesting objects. One of the themes in the book is that my mother and I had a very close, very loving relationship. And in the course of the book, I don't want to give away too many spoiler alerts, I realized that she sort of saved my life, that her divorce and her moving away from my biological father really did save my life. But at the time, I didn't know this. I didn't discover that until 30 years later when I hire detectives and find him. And I grew up all my life dreaming of who he might be and resenting her for taking him away from me. And his name could never be mentioned. He was like Voldemort, he who could not be named. I couldn't say his name. I couldn't write his name. At home. I couldn't ask about him. We never had a conversation about him. He simply was, you know, in the psychoanalytic tradition, you would say foreclosed. He could not be discussed. And I deeply resented this. And yet she was my rock. She was all I had. And when you do that to a child, that anger is going to come out somehow. And I describe a trip to Radcliffe for my admissions interview, which was all that I wanted, was to go away to college at Radcliffe. That was my dream. And my mother didn't tell me that she had cancer so that I wouldn't stay at home and take care of her, but would live my dream. And she goes with me to this admissions interview, which must have been so meaningful for her. You know, she had made this possible for me by keeping her secret, because I would have stayed in New York to take care of her in her last years. And as we're walking into the admissions interview with Dean Elliott, a Brahmin, you know, she was wearing like a Talbot suit. I mean, you know, and we were like wearing clothes from Abraham and Strauss in Brooklyn and pantyhose and little heels that would have been perfect for like the high holidays in Sheepshead Bay. I mean, we were just so dressed wrong. I see the steely glint of a hair clip from her giant bouffant 1960s hairdo, which kind of went up and out and twirled and curled. And she slept like on a cardboard box in order to keep it, you know, out there. And she had these galinty hair clips all lined up like soldiers in a row to keep that hairstyle together. And she had left in a clip. And in my, I don't want to say it was unintentional or unconscious, but in that anger towards her coming out, I tell her as we're leaving the interview, Mommy, you wore your hair clip was still in. We went into the interview, as though she had betrayed us. She had shown us to be the sort of lower class Brooklyn babes that we were. We didn't belong at Radcliffe. I didn't belong here. She didn't belong here. And she deflated. It was the cruelest. It was cruel. And I took this out of the book and put it back into the book, and took it out of the book and put it back into the book 15 times, because it shows my vulnerability more than I thought I wanted to show. And I finally left it in, and I say that if in life I could have one do-over, this would be my do-over. And whenever I see those clips, which are sort of coming back into the rage as people get back into these 60s hairdos, I think of that moment and the cruelty that I was capable of, because my mother would not have that conversation with me. So that's a good example of an object that showed the anger that I was capable of.
Yeah, and I think also it just shows our options for reflecting on our lives, right? Because you could just as you said, oh, it was an offhand comment I made. It was just a hair clip. It's not like I insulted her character or her aspirations or her qualities as a mother, right? And so I think you don't let yourself off the hook, right? You understand what the power that this moment had and the power that this object had,
Yes.
and how it did capture all of those other things. It was a stand-in for all those other things.
Yes.
So thank you for talking about that. Now, speaking of getting, holding our hand to the flame or looking at objects closely and the way we relate to them, I was thinking back to a session once when you visited Intel when I was a researcher there. We held a session, and this was your idea, like have everyone bring something, and then one by one you had people come up and they had these short, kind of public interviews with you, where you asked them about what they brought, and it was like how it shaped, how they thought about themselves, their work, and it was, I think everyone loved this and felt really seen. So I was wondering if I do something a little bit like this now, using your book and classes that I teach, where I ask students to write about. Students who are thinking of, who will later on in the term be, coming up with new concepts for technologies, but to start with thinking about their own lives and to write about a particular object that meant something to them, and how that object served in some sort of transition that was coming in their lives. But I wonder if you could talk about the value of that kind of reflection and as a way of having conversations.
Yes. Well, this, I came up with this actually when I was teaching with David Reisman as a graduate student. And I noticed that students were very shy about talking about anything. I was at Harvard, and students were very shy about talking about anything that would indicate their social status. Students wanted to be kind of all the same. It was the 60s. Students wanted to be all sort of the same. The early 70s, it was sort of a fiction of we're all the same. We're in college. There's no one's a preppy. No one has different social status, or didn't want to talk about cars, so nobody could talk about anything. And the course was on social structure in America. And so it really would not work. So I said, well, you have to talk about an object. And once people were talking about something concrete, they could talk about their life. So they said, you mean like a Spalding ball? You mean like a tennis ball? You mean like a tennis racket? You mean like a shoe? I said, yeah. mean like a dress? You mean, I said, yeah. And once people were talking about the dress they wore to prom, or that pink Spalding ball that they loved to do, my name is Alice. And they would talk about their friends and their lives and their first boyfriend and their first heartbreak and their relationship with their mother and how their father never played catch with them. And their whole lives would unfold because they had something to talk, concrete to talk about. And I really, there was lots of theory in anthropology and psychology to back me up. Transitional objects and evocative objects. I mean, there's Levi-Strauss and David Winnicott. And it was once I got into this, I found plenty of support in the literature. But the insight is that to get people talking about what's precious to you is really a help. And it was particularly useful to me when I got to MIT and I realized that my new topic was going to be the computer, digital technology as an intimate machine, as something that was going to change how we thought about ourselves as well as how we thought about intellectual matters. And everybody kept saying, well, that's really silly. The computer is just a tool. But once I got people talking about their desktop on the computer, it was like deeply emotional and really powerful. Or their program, the program they had written, or their particular computer and why was the best computer better than any other computer in the world. It was consequential and emotional. And I realized that we think with the objects we love the objects we think with. And it really has been a kind of methodology for me ever since then. And I teach a memoir course and I have people begin with an object. And in my book, I finally said when I came down to write my memoir, well, what about me? I'm going to do it too. And so my book is filled with my grandmother's dishes, the dishes that her mother bought for her as a wedding present on the push carts on the Lower East Side. Now, those dishes were the one thing that my grandmother thought would outlive her and that my children would use. And she's right. My daughter has Jewish holiday meals on those dishes, and I know that her children will. And that meant so much to my grandmother. And so even as I was using these dishes as a little girl, those dishes were there as a sort of, with that sense of a continuity of generations. And so on. And so all my objects are in this book. Actually, the dishes got their own art photography. So the dishes got their own art photography section during the pandemic.
So I know that they are featured, on the cover.
Yes.
But it sounds like, yeah.
But they're featured on the cover. The dishes are the framing of the cover, of the round cover, but they're also beautiful illustration, very arty illustration of the dishes in the book. And those dishes mean so much to me. I think of my grandmother whenever I use them. I love them. I'm very fond of those dishes. And my grandmother bought me a typewriter when I went away to college, and I was like the only one who didn't have a typewriter. I had to borrow a typewriter and the typewriter didn't work. And my grandmother went to Macy's and really by doing what she called depression cooking, that is by putting a lot of noodles in soup, and making the soup stretch, she saved up enough money to buy me a Smith Corona electric portable typewriter. And I still have it. It is just such an expression of her love, of her wanting me to have this thing that would allow me to succeed, really succeed at college. I've written everything important on it. And it was.
Did you write? Do you still write on it?
Yes, I do. Because you can do a different kind of
Wow.
writing when I don't write everything on it, but you can do a different kind of writing on a typewriter than you can on a computer, because you have to think of the sentence in your head before you type it. That's very hard.
Yeah.
That's very
I wouldn't
hard.
be able to do that, but yeah.
Well, if you have a Smith Corona electric portable typewriter from your grandmother, you would have to.
Yeah.
You know, our tools shape how we think, and it's such an example of that. It's such a wonderful example of that.
Yeah, I think, just one comment on that. I think, it's nice to hear you talk about your relationship to the typewriter, the other way, the people who you've interviewed and the way they relate to their desktops or their computers. I think sometimes you get characterized as someone who's anti-technology, and yet, you've written about the powerful ways in which people sort of develop a sense of themselves in part by through these technologies. So
I'm not anti-technology at all. That is just false. I am pro-conversation, and I am pro-empathy, and I get testy when I see a technology interfering or undermining empathy or undermining conversation or undermining our capacity for solitude, which is where empathy is born. So that's very different from being anti-technology.
Yeah.
Well, that's all. I don't want to veer the conversation off with that. I'm not anti-technology. I'm just pro-conversation and pro the capacity for solitude, because if you can't gather yourself, you can't come to someone else and have a mutual relationship.
Right. So there are some realizations that you had, as you mentioned, like for your mother's, complicated, complicated is what you've called a complicated relationship with the truth, or things that made your childhood difficult, and you didn't discover kind of why until later. So there were ways in which she let you down or made life challenging for you. There were ways in which your biological father was very disappointing to you. There were ways in which your first husband was very disappointing, right? And you write about these relationships with such, despite these violations, right? With a lot of vulnerability and openness. And, in addition to the, kind of major injuries that you experienced, there was kind of a lower grade, constant kind of an alter reality that you had to navigate, and things where you were figuring out the rules at home, but again, not necessarily being able to speak those. So I was wondering if you could read from a section where you had finally convinced your mother to allow you to have a sleepover, and some of the surprises that happened.
Right. The way I put it in the book is that for me, empathy was a survival mechanism before it was a psychological virtue, because I really couldn't figure out the rules of this family. I mean, why couldn't I say my father's name? I mean, I try to put myself back in the point of view of a child, trying to figure out what was going on in these adults' mind. And I really could not figure out the rules of the road in my family. And this particular paragraph that you asked me to read is I discover the rules of the road, I become empathic, and I don't like what I discover, which kind of makes the point that empathy doesn't mean kumbaya. That just because you get empathic doesn't mean you like what you find. Okay. Let me just find it. Okay. I asked if please, during the summer after 9th grade, I could invite a friend to visit me at Rockaway for a sleepover. I was invited to sleep over with other girls' families, and I wanted to return these invitations. Only now can I appreciate the pain this caused my family. At the time, I didn't understand their insecurity. Above all, they feared exposure. They didn't know if how they ate, what they ate, how they talked were okay. Somehow I was given permission for a Rockaway sleepover. My mother said that my friend could sleep with me on the living room daybed. Rockaway was where we went in the summer. It had a little bungalow. So I invited a Mark Twain classmate, Susan, to Rockaway. It was everything I'd imagined. Susan showed me how to section my hair geometrically before putting it in rollers and to use beer as a setting gel. We bought teasing combs at the 5 and Dime and worked on putting our hair up in French twists. We practiced walking in high heels. We didn't own any real ones yet, but she had a Salvation Army pair for practice. We told each other secrets. I had real secrets. I didn't tell her those, of course, but came up with the kind of secrets she wanted, like who was my crush. We made a tent with our light summer blankets, turned on flashlights, and listened to Ricky Nelson singing Traveling Man on the radio. I remember Susan's departure. I think her older brother picked her up, and I was so happy that no one in my family had to be inconvenienced by my sleepover. I kissed her goodbye. I thought the visit was a great success. I was unprepared to come into the kitchen and find my mother stone-faced. What's the matter? We can discuss it later. What's the matter? I'm not sure that this is the kind of friend who will be a good influence on you. My mother, in her typical way, thought I understood the problem with her having to name it. Usually she was right. This time I had to cross-examine her. My friend Susan had not brought a house gift. She had not brought any of her own money. So when we went out for ice cream, she had not offered to buy it for us, a gesture to her hosts. This showed her to be someone who was not raised in a good family. I defended my friend. This was so unfair. No one had taught me these house gift rules. Susan's family was financially struggling. How unfair to accuse her of not being willing to treat us to ice cream. And then suddenly I understood. In my mother's mind, my intelligence was to be used to associate us with our betters. Susan would not suit. My mother saw us as a team. I was ashamed of our team.
Yeah, it's a really touching story. I mean, because it seems like during the sleepover, you've mastered some of the codes. You know that you can't tell the real secrets, right? You have to make up the kind of socially acceptable secrets to tell your friend. Yeah. And know that you had quite a bit of work to do to convince your mother to have the sleepover, but then the shock that it didn't go well because of some new set of rules, and realizing how those were at odds with your emerging values and understanding of how the world should work. And in contrast,
also that
it
I
seems
was
like
being used. I was being used in a transactional way. That was the first time that I realized that I was a chit. I mean, it had never occurred to me. It had genuinely never occurred to me that I was an asset, an object.
Can you talk about others who were in your life as a child who were available to you in a more reliable way, in a more steadily nurturing way?
Well, my mother was a complicated figure because she was available, very available in a nurturing way, but she had this desire to create a reality. You know, the way she lived was to create a reality of her own when she couldn't face the reality that was. When, you know, she feared that the man she had been married to and the fact of her divorce would cause her to be shunned from her community. And so she created a different reality. But she did other things like that. Like she thought she was too tall. She was magnificent. She was 5'11", maybe 5'11 and a half. She was almost 6 feet. And she thought that was too tall for a woman. She was a magnificent creature. And she just thought that was too tall. So she would go to the division of motor vehicles to get her license. And she would explain to the ladies that she needed to be shorter to catch a man when she was single. And she would just ask them if they would like take an inch off her height, and then the next year a half inch off her height. By the time she was dead, and I looked through her papers, my 6 foot tall mother was like 5'7". I mean, she was 20 years younger than she was, and 5'7". I mean, she just had this capacity to, to just be other, because she wanted to be in a different world. So she was her own special case. But my grandmother and my Aunt Mildred were really rocks and really much steadier forces for me. And my grandfather, who was a manager of a Times Square motion picture house, which was kind of a place where they showed not so much pornography, but kind of cowboy movies, and people would come to his bums, he called them, would come to the theater at 8 o'clock in the morning and stay through till 4 o'clock in the morning when the theater closed. And then there'd be like 4 hours when they'd have to be on the street, and then they'd come back, and he was very gentle with them. And they would eat food at the concession stand. They would subsist on frankfurters and sodas and candy, and every once in a while he'd bring them something nutritious from my grandmother, and he kind of took care of them. And he was a big guy and very hefty, and during the war he had worked on the piers, and this was like the perfect job for him. He'd been taking care of he'd had to drop out of school when he was 12 years old in order to take care of his 5 brothers and sisters, and his father had died. So he was also a very brilliant man, and really somebody who was a very stable presence. So all of these people were very, my aunt, my mother, my grandmother, they were deeply invested in me. But the mystery was, to me, why did they all go along with this lie? All these very very sane and very stable people all went along with my mother's lie. And I think it really had to do partly with the community, the Jewish community that they lived in at the time. It was not okay to be divorced. And also it turned out that when I did find my father, not too much of a spoiler alert, he was a little nutty. And I think that my mother feared the stigma of having been married to somebody who might have been labeled as having some kind of severe problem. And had I inherited that problem, would I be stigmatized as someone who would be shunned as well? Would she be shunned? Would I be shunned? In any case, she couldn't tolerate that. And but I really had my fans, and I had my group.
When I think of your aunt, I immediately imagine your speedy suitcase.
Yes.
And think about the scheming that the two of you did to procure it. And I wonder if you could talk about that visit and just a little bit how that happened.
Right. Well, for those of you who may not know what a speedy is, it was a nickname given to essentially a shape bag that's known as the Boston bag that was made by Christian Dior beginning in the 70s. Perhaps it was made earlier, but I laid my eyes on it in the late 60s, early 70s. And when I was in Paris after my mother died, I dropped out of school. And I was I was working as a cleaning lady. I was called Portuguese because all the cleaning ladies at that time were Portuguese. And the people I was working for didn't want to have to bother learning my name. So they just called me Le Portuguese. And it was actually very important to have an experience of being called by a generic, because that's an amazing experience to have, actually. And I was cleaning floors and doing windows and for this room. And my aunt came to visit me, and of course she took me out to restaurants, and and visited me in my little garret. And I was just turning 21, and she said, "Sherry, your mom died, you dropped out of school, you're working as a cleaning lady, let's celebrate your birthday. What can I get you?" Because my aunt had a little bit more money because she was a single woman, and she had a steady job. And what can I get you that can commemorate this? And I'd all year, I'd been looking at this one thing, this Speedy bag, this Boston bag that had a beautiful shape. It was a kind of carry-on bag. And I imagined that my hero, Susan Sontag or Joan Didion or Lillian Hellman, people like that would go on an airplane and their manuscripts would be in the Speedy bag, or their little Olivetti would be tucked in the Speedy bag, or their current manuscript or the speech they would be giving would be in the Speedy bag, or their change of clothes, or their their makeup. And I just said, I just thought, when I grow up to be one of them, because I imagined even then that I would be a writer, I will have something like this. And I said, well, it's too expensive, but the thing that someday I want. And I took her to the store and showed her the Speedy bag. And I don't know how much it costs at this point. And she said, "We've got to get the Speedy bag. That's it. That's what Lillian Hellman would definitely have. That is exactly what Susan Sontag would carry." She just had the most wonderful, my aunt was so, I adored her. She said, "That is definitely what Susan Sontag would carry." And she checked out of her hotel, and she got into my bed, and we ate, instead of eating, at restaurants, we just bought, croque monsieur off the streets, and we ate in my little room. And from what she was paying for a hotel and economizing on food and just making lemonades from lemons and water, we bought the Speedy bag, which what was my most precious, which I still have, which is my most precious evocative object. And it symbolized, it was really, you could read it as obnoxious, that there I was in Paris, and the first thing I buy is a designer handbag, but it was, for my aunt and me, our pact that I was going to make something of myself, and that, I had done without. I dropped out of college. I'd taken care of my sister and brother. I'd sort of tried to take care of my stepfather. I tried to take care of my grandparents. I tried to take care of everybody. And this was the first thing that she was giving to me, a kind of symbol that she would try to just give me something crazy. And it was a beautiful gesture, and it was, it's one of the many pieces of luggage and jewelry and clothes that make their appearance in my book.
Yeah, I think that is the most symbolically evident or rich when I think about your journey. intellectually, personally, this bag seems to have always been with you, as your aunt was, internalized. And
do you think I did the speedy bag justice?
Well, I have never seen a speedy bag, but I have now, sort of idealized images in my head.
You must have one.
I have my own, I have a similar bag that I bought at one, not, I'm sure, nowhere near the beauty of the speedy, but I relate to the joy, I guess the attachment to a particular piece of luggage that I got at a particular time.
Right.
And even though that bag has ceased working, it is in my taking up precious closet space. Yeah. So I relate.
But the speedy went along with there were certain beautiful French objects of writing paper, French writing paper, and French pens and pencils, that I thought that if I had those, I would also be a better writer. So many objects.
Well, it seemed like they didn't hurt.
They didn't hurt.
So I want to ask you just a little bit about mentoring. I mean, you've been, as I mentioned, incredibly important to me as a mentor, as an inspiration. And when we first met, I was so happy to learn about your work and the intensity with which you worked. And it helped me, think about my own work and recognize its value, even though it was quite different from like the very structured psychology in which I'd been trained, right? And it was, so I wanted to just kind of ask you how you think about mentoring. Feel free to talk about mentors that have been important to you. But mostly how you think mentoring works. Yeah.
I think the people I mentor, I think what they need from me is my full attention, that they give me something to read, and I absolutely give it my full attention. I don't skimp. I don't timeshare it with, I treat it as though reading this piece of work or listening to their project is not something I'm, doing as I'm doing a lot of other things. I treat it as though this is my full job. And so they need me to read their work really carefully, empathically. They need me to understand what they're doing and put myself in it fully. And they need me to say how I would improve it. But I always say that I speak my mind fully because I don't expect my advice to be taken. I just like to speak freely about the intellectual problem. And I think that's what makes the best mentoring situation, is when your mentee understands that I don't need them to take my advice, that I'm fine with my work, but I'm absolutely telling you, putting myself in your problem, not telling you what I would do, but putting myself not in your place, but in your problem with what you need to have happen in your career next. And then telling you, well, given that, what might make sense for you. So it's very different from saying, well, given this, here's what I would do next. It's putting myself in your problem. Here are some options for you. And that actually...
So is it fair to say it's... Go ahead.
No, I think I'm making a distinction.
It sounds like
it's empathic. It's my definition of empathy.
Yeah.
Is that you don't put it's not just telling somebody what you would do. It's the humility of really understanding where they are and putting themselves, their problem, as opposed to just projecting what I would do if I were you.
So it's the experience of being empathized with is the power in being mentored.
Yes. Really listening to them. And if they're saying to me, what I really want is do something empirical and quantitative to really nail this, that's what would gratify me. That's not my time to say, well, I would really do something qualitative and psychoanalytic with it. I say, yeah, that's what you want to do. No, here's the best advice I can give you to do that empirical and quantitative thing, as opposed to, well, my talents are to do something. It's really the humility of really listening to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And I had some wonderful mentors who did that for me. I think Stanley Hoffman, George Homans, Marty Peretz, David Reisman, people I write about in this book, Victor Turner, who really read Barrington Moore, my undergraduate thesis advisor. They really read my work, and they really sat down with me, and Barrington Moore was a social historian who, he never did anything like what I did. And he said, you have some gifts. Basically he was saying, I don't have your gifts at all. I'm not even interested. I'm not even interested in cultivating them. But I think you have some gifts. And here are some, given your gifts, here are some things you could do with your gifts. And at the time, there were no women who had day jobs as professors at Harvard. And I remember saying to David Reisman, well, could I earn a living? I need to earn a living. I don't have any money. And he said to me, follow it through until you run into a bump, and then come talk to me if that happens, and we'll figure out, what else. You'll learn a trade. I don't know what he didn't offer false hope. He just said, I think there are going to start to be openings. I think it's going to happen. He didn't put down my anxiety. He said, follow it through until you hit the bump. And then, it just worked out that I followed it through until I hit the bump.
I wonder, I have some more follow-up questions for you, but I'm also noticing that we are, I want to make sure, is this the time that we're supposed to pause for questions, or is it okay to keep asking you questions?
Yeah, I don't currently have any questions from the audience, but
Okay.
I will just say, audience, please submit questions if you have them, and I can come back on once they come in.
Okay, great. So with that discussion, or that definition of mentoring as empathizing, I guess following up on that is a question about, advice for people, and maybe this is antithetical actually to that, because if we don't, maybe it's hard to give advice in a generic way, but I bet that there are a lot of people who want to sort of have a kind of impact sort of similar to yours. They want to improve our situation with regard to technology, either by changing technology or by changing policy. And I think you came about that through this very rich, incredibly rigorous study in social sciences and the humanities, and then came to technology through that critical lens, right? But now there are options because, of your work and other work, there are fields where you can go directly to shape technology, or you could study user-centered design, in a master's degree or in a PhD program. And I wonder what you think just about those two different approaches. And mine is more similar to yours, right? Studying humanities and then becoming a clinical psychologist. And so I sympathize, but I just wanted to open that up.
Well, I think it's very hard to give this advice. I like it that I really know psychology very deeply. Because I always feel that when I'm confused, like, for example, people say, well, what's going now in the pandemic? What's the psychology of our coming down out of the pandemic now? And what role should technology play in it? I feel that I can recenter myself in psychological theory and psychological research and think of what, there's no one answer. Different people will have different routes out and different needs and different vulnerabilities. But I know how to think about different people's vulnerabilities and what the pandemic has meant for them. So, for example, some people are waiting for the full embrace of the human, having been stuck with their screens. And some people have vulnerabilities such that it has been very calming and has assuaged their anxieties to be hidden behind a screen. Both things are true. And so because I have my confidence in sort of psychology, having seen a lot of patients, having done a lot of theory, I know I have confidence when I say, well, that's a complicated question. Let me tell you why it's a complicated question, but here's how we can study the many paths. If I had just studied user interface or kind of media studies, or I think I would, for me, I would be less confident about the sorts of things I like to think about. So I probably have a bias to study anthropology, really learn how to do field work, really learn how to do interviews, or really study psychology, become a great anthropologist, become a great field worker, become a great social psychologist or clinician.
Thank you. Yeah.
Then, but that's my personal answer. That's what gives me my confidence.
I want to pause because we have a question from the audience. Are you comfortable taking a question from the audience?
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, so this is from Christina. She says, thanks so much for your work, Sherry. I'm wondering what you think on concepts like digital minimalism.
I don't know what digital minimalism is.
All right, that answers that.
I want to make sure that I don't pretend that is digital minimalism like using the least digital technology possible?
Well, I can't say either, but Christina, if you want to elaborate, feel free to throw that in the chat.
Margie, do you know what digital minimalism
Well, I think
is?
I think it's a book by Cal Newport, and an approach to not getting distracted by social media and things like that, like doing what's important to your career or your life. And so I think
like using the least digital, digital media possible. I have mixed feelings because everything for me depends on whether you are giving your full focused attention to people when you need to, and whether your digital technology is interfering with that process. So, for example, when I'm writing, so I haven't read the book, so so I'm not commenting on the book and perhaps and his particular meaning. When I'm writing, I'm using a digital technology many, many hours a day, and editing on it and re-editing on it and re-editing on it and re-editing on it. It feels like digital maximalism. But when I need to talk to you, I mean, other than the pandemic, I put that away. And for example, for my student office hours during the pandemic, I had them on telephone because I felt that on the telephone, I wasn't worried about, looking at the little green light or worrying about their background. I didn't have to worry about their background. I didn't have to worry about, was I lit? I could just focus on their voice and getting the subtle intonations of their voice and how they sounded, and really follow their voice and get the maximum information to be empathic with their voice. So I put the digital technology away in order to be as fully present as possible with the person. So I try to use an algorithm, sort of a rule, that I'm trying to be as fully present to people as I possibly can be. But I don't worry particularly how much time I'm spending in front of my computer if I'm using my computer appropriately. So for example, in terms of screen time, when my daughter was growing up, we watched Disney movies, and we would talk to these movies, and no Gaston, no Belle, you shouldn't marry Gaston, you should marry the Beast. I mean, we were very involved with screens. And I didn't for 1 minute, just the way my family growing up would be constantly talking to the television screen. I didn't worry for 1 minute that I had too much screen time with her, because she was involved with me. She was involved with a story. I didn't say, oh my God, that was a 3-hour long, with many pauses we spent on Beauty and the Beast, and it was too much screen time, because she was with me, and then we'd have dinner and we'd eat and we'd talk. So I'm less into screen time and more into where is your attention, and is your attention with people. I think though that one thing that, just to make sure you understand me, is that one thing I think that's been good about the pandemic is that, not good about the pandemic, but where it leaves us in a good place, is that if somebody comes now pitching, oh, I have a program for you that's going to teach your children a content, and then it's going to, monitor their keystrokes, so we can personalize learning for them, and it's going to, be a tutor just personally for them. I think most parents are going to say, give my child a person, give my child a mentor, give my child a loving mentor. Whereas I think before the pandemic, we were much more vulnerable to the pitch that somehow personalized on-screen instruction was going to be like so fabulous for us. So I think I'm for digital minimalism when, in the sense that I think that we're too eager to turn to screens when we really need people, in that sense. But I don't, that's a long answer. So anyway, that's what I'm trying to define a position here.
I enjoyed hearing you talk about that. And I wanted, to follow up by asking you about, looping back to this idea of talking back to the TV and kind of having a pretty agentic stance towards technology. And you write at the end of the book, you write about your own path, right, and having to be very active and, clever to negotiate the hurdles in your home life. That you write about that as a metaphor for challenging technology. And I think with the idea that we are not challenging technology enough currently. And I was wondering if you could say more about that.
Yes, and then would you like me then to read the final piece after I say something about that?
Yes, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
Well, my mother basically took me out of a situation where I was going to be damaged with my biological father to a situation with Milton Turkle that wasn't good. This situation where I was lying about my name and then, hiding my name in my books and lying to everybody, and that wasn't good. But the way the second situation wasn't good was a situation in which I'll argue in this reading, where things could be negotiated. And I use that difference between things being shut down to where things can be negotiated as a kind of metaphor for where we should be trying to head with technology. That we have to get to a place where we feel that we can pipe up and say, Mark Zuckerberg, you don't care about privacy, democracy, and intimacy, but I do. I do. I think that needs to be negotiated. And so here's how I try to capture that by an analogy with my own life. Okay, so this is really how I end. To fix our crisis of intimacy and privacy, of empathy and human connection, we don't need more apps. We need one another. We are the empathy app. And we have the potential to do the right thing when it counts. It's not too late to reshape the digital to serve the human. My mother got us from Bayside to Murdoch Court, that is from where I was born to where the Turkles lived, from something toxic to something imperfect with which I could negotiate. And that's why she remains my heroine. That she put me on a difficult path seems like a metaphor for what lies ahead when we challenge technology's status quo. I could navigate the Turkle household because the troubles I faced there involve people in their emotional complexity, including jealousy and irrationality. I grew up talking my way through it. In contrast, if you're the object in an experiment, there's no talk back. As we face down a suite of technologies that objectify us, we can insist on a future where we can construct new terms, a new way of living with our inventions. Technology presents itself as opaque, impenetrable, inevitable as it has been delivered. It is none of those things. It can be analyzed, made transparent, and brought under control. Technology proposes a noble leap that will bond us so tightly to objects that we become as one with them. To resist that takes hard work, because not only does technology offer the friction-free as where it wants to take us, but it makes the path to getting there the one of least resistance. But that's the path that politics and human relationships have in common, the uncertain glory of a stumbling climb. It's not the world of the friction-free. It's the world of negotiating with people, unknown, disappointing, transcendent. It's ours.
Thank you. I think that's wonderful.
Thank you.
I think that's a really nice place to wrap up. I also think I'm in good company in saying I'm looking forward to a part 2 of your memoir. So.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really a pleasure for me, so many ways.
Yeah, and thank you both so much for being here tonight on behalf of Town Hall. Just thank you so much. I found a lot in your conversation that I could really relate to, and so I really appreciated that. So interesting to think about our attachment to objects and, processing our family dynamics and all of that. Just thank you so much for your work and for this book. I think it's really fascinating. And I want to thank the audience as well. If you're interested in getting a copy of the Empathy Diaries, use the link in the chat, and that's going to take you right over to Third Place Books, and you can support our local bookstore and see what else is coming up on our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. So hopefully next time we have you both, we can be in the building and together and not through this weird digital world. But until then, I hope you stay safe and have a great night.
Thank you. Take care.